The courthouse hallway seemed to stretch on forever, an endless corridor of beige walls and fluorescent lights that made everything look washed out and lifeless. 9-year-old Emma sat on a wooden bench that was far too hard for comfort, her legs dangling slightly above the polished floor. Her new dress, the one her mother had insisted she wear because the judge needs to see you're a responsible, well-cared-for child, felt itchy and restrictive around her neck. The navy blue fabric was meant to make her look presentable, trustworthy, innocent. But Emma felt none of those things. She felt terrified. In her small, trembling hands, she held a photograph. It was slightly crinkled at the edges because she'd looked at it so many times over the past 3 months that the creases had become permanent. The photo showed Emma at 7 years old, her face absolutely radiant with joy, her arms wrapped around Max's neck. Max was a gorgeous golden retriever with fur that seemed to glow in the sunlight, his tongue hanging out in what looked like a permanent smile. They were sitting in her father's backyard, surrounded by cherry blossom trees. It had been taken on Emma's birthday 2 years ago, before everything fell apart. She pressed the photograph against her chest, as if she could absorb the happiness from that moment, as if the joy captured in that image could somehow protect her today. The courthouse was crowded with people. Lawyers in expensive suits rushed back and forth, their leather briefcases clacking against their legs. Parents and children sat on the benches, some looking hopeful, others looking devastated. Emma tried not to make eye contact with anyone. She'd learned over the past few months that looking at people's faces only made things worse. Everyone had an agenda. Everyone wanted something from her. Nobody actually cared about what she wanted, what she felt, or what was breaking inside her chest every single day. Her mother was somewhere down the hallway with her lawyer, a tall man with slicked-back hair and cold, calculating eyes. Emma's mother had spent the last 3 months telling her stories. Not lies exactly. Emma was smart enough to know when adults weren't being completely truthful, but selective truths, stories designed to paint her father as a villain. "Your father doesn't really love you the way I do," her mother would say during their late-night conversations. "He only wants to control you, to use you against me. Real love means protecting you from harm, and your father is harmful." Emma's father, on the other hand, was down the hallway in the opposite direction with his lawyer, a sharp woman with kind eyes who always spoke to Emma like she was an intelligent human being rather than a pawn to be moved across a chessboard. Her father's story was equally compelling in the opposite direction. "Your mother is trying to poison you against me because she's angry about our divorce," he'd explained during their last visit. "She wants to hurt me by taking you away. But I love you more than anything in this world, and I will never stop fighting for you." Emma loved both of them. That was the problem nobody seemed to understand. That was the truth that didn't fit neatly into either parent's narrative. She'd tried telling them this. During the previous hearings, she'd been called to testify. The experience had been horrifying. The lawyers had asked her leading questions designed to get her to say damaging things about the other parent. Didn't your father ever raise his voice at you? Didn't your mother ever say mean things about your father? The questions were crafted like traps, and Emma found herself walking straight into them because she was too polite, too eager to please, too desperate to give everyone what they wanted. But the truth was more complicated than any of their narratives allowed. Yes, her father raised his voice sometimes, but only when he was frustrated about her schoolwork or safety. He'd never been mean or abusive. He'd never frightened her. He'd never made her feel unloved or unwanted. In fact, her father was one of the most patient, gentle men she knew. He'd taught her to ride a bike, to tie her shoes, to throw a baseball. He'd dried her tears when she scraped her knees. He'd read her stories before bed, doing all the voices of the characters, making her laugh until her stomach hurt. Yes, her mother had said some harsh things about her father, but Emma had come to understand that her mother was hurting. The divorce had devastated her mother in ways that Emma was only beginning to comprehend. Her mother had been betrayed, emotionally devastated, financially stressed. Sometimes people lashed out when they were in pain. That didn't make her mother a bad person. It made her human. A hurting human who sometimes made mistakes in trying to protect herself and her daughter. The problem was that this complexity, this nuance, this human understanding of both her parents' flaws and strengths wasn't welcome in the courtroom. The courtroom wanted heroes and villains. It wanted clear-cut cases with obvious solutions. It wanted Emma to choose sides, to declare one parent the winner and one the loser. Emma refused to do it, not because she was being stubborn, but because it would have been a lie, and she was tired of lies. That's why she'd formulated her plan 3 weeks ago. It had started when she overheard her mother's new boyfriend talking on the phone about his dog training business. He'd mentioned that dogs could be trained to respond to nearly invisible hand signals. He talked about how much more effective subtle communication was than shouting commands. Emma had listened intently, her young mind immediately grasping the implications and possibilities. She'd asked 100 questions. He'd laughed and answered them all, probably thinking she was just a curious kid. But Emma was more than curious. She was desperate. She was searching for a way to communicate truth that the legal system couldn't dismiss or manipulate. That night, she'd gone to her room and called Max up onto her bed. The golden retriever had been as confused about the divorce as Emma was. He'd been passed back and forth between houses, just like Emma. He'd been confused by the tension and anger, just like Emma. But Max loved her unconditionally, without requiring her to choose sides or prove her loyalty. Max's love was simple and pure, and exactly what Emma needed. Over the past 3 weeks, she'd been training him. Every day after school, every evening before bed, she'd spent time teaching him to respond to specific hand signals. It had taken patience, consistency, and a lot of treats, but Max was an intelligent dog, eager to please and deeply attuned to Emma's emotional state. He seemed to sense that she needed him, that something important was at stake, and he'd become the most focused, obedient student. Now, sitting in this courthouse hallway, Emma's heart pounded as she thought about what she was about to do. Her palms were sweaty. Her stomach churned with anxiety. What if it didn't work? What if the judge didn't see what she was trying to show? What if she just made everything worse? She clutched the photograph and took a deep breath. She had to try. For herself, for her father, for her mother, for Max, and for the truth that nobody was willing to hear any other way. The courthouse clock on the wall showed 9:47. The final hearing would begin in 13 minutes. Emma closed her eyes and visualized Max's face. She thought about all their practice sessions, all their secret signals, all the love and trust between them. She thought about the truth she needed to communicate. She was ready. When the bailiff appeared at the end of the hallway and called her name, Emma stood up slowly, smoothed down her itchy navy dress, and walked toward the courtroom doors. The last straw was about to break the camel's back, but this time it wouldn't be because of lies or manipulation. It would be because of love. It would be because of truth. It would be because of Max. 3 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday afternoon that had started like any other, Emma's life changed direction in the most unexpected way. She had been sitting in her mother's living room, pretending to do her homework while actually listening to her mother's boyfriend of 6 months, talking on the phone in the kitchen. Was a dog trainer by profession, not the aggressive type that trained attack dogs, but the kind that worked with families to help their pets become well-behaved companions. He had a small business called Happy Paws Training, and he seemed to take genuine pride in his work. Emma hadn't initially paid much attention to. He was just another adult in her complicated, fractured world. But on this particular Tuesday, something he said changed everything. Yeah, I know the German Shepherd seems stubborn," was saying to whoever was on the other end of the phone. "But here's the thing about dogs. They're incredibly responsive to subtle communication. Most people don't realize that you don't need to yell commands or use force. In fact, that usually makes things worse. A tiny hand signal, a specific gesture, something barely noticeable to most observers, that's what really gets through to them. Dogs are so attuned to human body language that they pick up on the smallest movements. I've trained dogs to respond to hand signals so subtle that people watching wouldn't even realize I was giving a command." Emma's pencil had frozen mid-sentence on her math homework. Her mind had immediately seized on what was saying, turning it over and examining it from every angle. Her young brain, sharpened by months of emotional stress and desperation, had immediately grasped the potential. What if she could use this? What if she could train Max to respond to signals that nobody else would notice? What if she could create a secret language between herself and her dog, a way to communicate something true that the lawyers and judges and her parents' endless arguments were preventing her from expressing? That night, after had left and her mother had gone to bed, Emma had carefully approached the subject. She'd walked into the kitchen where was making a late-night snack and asked casually, "Can I ask you about your dog training stuff?" Had looked pleasantly surprised. He'd been trying for months to connect with Emma, and she'd mostly rebuffed his attempts, loyal to her father and suspicious of this man who represented her parents' broken marriage. But desperation has a way of breaking down walls that pride normally maintains. "Of course, I love talking about dog training," had said, leaning against the counter with his sandwich in hand. "What do you want to know?" Emma had spent the next hour asking him detailed questions. How specifically did dogs learn hand signals? How much repetition did they need? Could a dog learn multiple signals? How could you communicate complexity through gesture? Apparently delighted to have someone interested in his profession, had answered every question thoroughly and with genuine enthusiasm. He'd explained how dogs have incredible visual perception and can read human body language with remarkable precision. He'd talked about the difference between auditory commands and visual signals, explaining that visual signals were actually often more effective because they didn't require sound. He described specific training techniques, how to use positive reinforcement, how to break complex behaviors down into smaller, more manageable pieces, how to practice consistently until the signal became automatic. By the end of the conversation, Emma had a comprehensive understanding of exactly how to train Max to respond to hand signals. Had even shown her some videos on his phone of dogs he'd trained, responding to gestures so subtle that Emma had to watch them multiple times to even see the hand movements. The next morning before school, Emma had gone to the garage where Max spent most of his time when she wasn't home. The golden retriever had been thrilled to see her, his whole body wiggling with excitement. Emma had sat down on the concrete floor, and Max had immediately curled up in her lap, as much of his large body as could fit anyway. She'd held his face in her hands and looked into his soulful brown eyes. "Max," she'd whispered, "I need your help. I need you to learn something really important. Can you do that for me?" Max had licked her face, his tail thumping against the ground. That was all the encouragement Emma needed. She'd started with the simplest signal, a tap on her thigh. She'd tapped her leg, immediately said, "Sit," and when Max sat, she'd given him a treat and praised him enthusiastically. She'd repeated this exercise over and over dozens of times until Max was sitting reliably after each tap. The first training session had lasted 45 minutes, and by the end, Emma was exhausted but exhilarated. Max had learned. It had worked. Over the following weeks, Emma had become obsessed with the training. Every opportunity she got, she practiced with Max. She created a signal for "come closer," a specific hand movement that drew her hand toward her chest. She created a signal for "stay," a flat palm held up. She created a signal for "bark," a double tap on her thigh followed by a pointing gesture. She created a signal for "look at me," snapping her fingers and making eye contact. Most importantly, she created what she thought of as her truth signal. This one was more complex. It was a gentle hand gesture, her palm facing outward, moving slowly from left to right across her body. When Emma gave this signal, she wanted Max to understand that something important was about to happen. She wanted him to stay close to her, to be present with her, to show the world that they were connected in a way that transcended everything else. Max had seemed to understand on a level that went beyond mere training. The golden retriever had always been deeply bonded to Emma, but as the weeks progressed and the training intensified, that bond had seemed to deepen even further. Max seemed to sense that something significant was happening, that his girl needed him for something larger than just regular companionship. Emma had hidden her training sessions carefully. She'd practice when her mother was out, when was at work, when she was supposed to be doing other things. She'd practice during lunch breaks at school, thinking through the signals and mentally rehearsing how Max would respond. She'd created a private notebook where she sketched out the hand signals and wrote detailed descriptions of what each one meant. Her best friend at school, Tyler, had noticed something was up. "Emma, you've been kind of weird lately," he'd said one day. "You're always kind of practicing something with your hands, like you're doing secret hand signals or something." Emma had laughed it off, but inside she'd been impressed by how perceptive he was. That was exactly what she was doing. She was developing a secret language, a way to communicate with Max that existed outside of words, outside of the legal system, outside of all the manipulation and arguments and lies. By the time 3 weeks had passed, Emma and Max had developed an intricate system of signals and responses. It wasn't just tricks. It was genuine communication between a girl and her dog. It was a bond made visible, a love made tangible. And Emma knew, with the certainty that only a desperate child can possess, that this secret language was going to change everything. On the night before the final hearing, Emma had taken Max into her bedroom and closed the door. She'd run through all their signals one final time. Each one had been executed perfectly. Max had responded with the enthusiasm and precision of a dog who understood that something important depended on his cooperation. Emma had hugged him tightly and whispered, "Tomorrow, Max. Tomorrow you're going to help me tell the truth." Max had rested his head on her shoulder, and in that moment, Emma had felt less alone than she had in months. The courtroom doors loomed ahead of Emma like the entrance to a fortress. They were tall, heavy wooden doors with brass handles that gleamed under the fluorescent courthouse lights. The bailiff, an older man with kind eyes whose name was Officer Martinez, had gently guided her toward them. He'd been the same bailiff for 3 previous hearings, and he'd always treated Emma with respect, speaking to her in a normal voice rather than the condescending tones so many adults adopted when talking to children. "You ready, Emma?" he'd asked, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. She'd nodded, not trusting her voice. Her throat felt like someone had packed it with cotton. Her hands were trembling so badly that she'd shoved them into the pockets of her navy dress to hide the shaking. Officer Martinez had opened the doors, and Emma had stepped through into controlled chaos. The courtroom was much larger than she'd remembered from the previous hearings. Or maybe she'd just been too nervous the first times to fully absorb the space. Now, as she walked in, the sheer size of it seemed to dwarf her, to make her feel impossibly small and insignificant. The ceiling soared high above, with exposed beams and recessed lighting. The walls were a pale cream color, and the entire back half of the room was lined with wooden benches where spectators sat. Several people turned to look at her as she entered. A woman with a baby, an elderly couple, a younger man in a business suit. Emma's eyes immediately sought out her parents. Her mother sat on the left side of the courtroom, directly behind Mr. her lawyer. She was wearing a professional gray suit and had her hair done up neatly. She looked composed, put together, exactly like the kind of mother who should win a custody case. When her mother saw Emma, her face lit up with a smile. But Emma could see the tension behind it, the way her mother's jaw was slightly clenched, the way her hands gripped the edge of the table with white knuckles. Her father sat on the right side of the courtroom with Mrs. He was wearing a dark blue suit that Emma had helped him pick out at the mall weeks ago. He looked pale, exhausted, like a man who hadn't slept properly in months. When he saw Emma, his face crumpled slightly with emotion, but he quickly composed himself. He gave her a small, encouraging smile and a subtle nod. Emma could see the hope in his eyes, hope that something would happen today to change the trajectory of his life, to allow him to be a full parent again, rather than a visitor his ex-wife grudgingly allowed to see his daughter. Judge Helena Cross was already seated at her elevated bench, reviewing documents with an expression of profound disinterest. She was a woman in her mid-60s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, sharp cheekbones, and eyes that seemed to have seen far too much human suffering and deception over her 28 years on the bench. Her black robes hung from her shoulders, making her look somehow both official and slightly archaic, like a remnant from another era when justice had been simpler and clearer. The judge didn't look up as Emma was escorted to the witness stand. Officer Martinez helped Emma into the chair, which was far too high, and Emma's feet dangled uselessly above the floor. A court reporter sat at a small desk to the side, her fingers poised over the stenotype machine, ready to capture every word that would be spoken in this room. Finally, Judge Cross looked up from her documents and made eye contact with Emma. Her gaze was unsettling, analytical, skeptical, as if she was trying to see through Emma's skin to some essential truth beneath. Emma felt her stomach flutter with nervousness. "Good morning, Emma," the judge said, her voice formal and distant. "I'm Judge Helena Cross. You've been here before, haven't you?" "Yes, Your Honor," Emma managed, her voice coming out smaller and more frightened than she'd intended. "Do you understand that you've sworn to tell the truth today?" "Yes, Your Honor." The judge nodded, as if this wasn't really a meaningful question. Of course, children understood the concept of truthfulness, her expression seemed to say. They just often lied anyway because they were easily influenced by their parents. Mr. Emma's mother's lawyer stood up. He was a tall man, probably in his mid-50s, with slicked-back black hair and the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Emma had heard him practice his questioning at her mother's house, listening through her bedroom door as he and her mother discussed strategy like generals planning a military campaign. "Emma, I'd like to ask you a few questions about your relationship with your father," he began, approaching the witness stand with the careful, measured steps of a predator stalking prey. "How often do you see your father?" "Every other weekend," Emma answered, "and 2 weeks in the summer." "And how would you characterize those visits? Do you enjoy spending time with him?" "Yes," Emma said carefully. She could see where this was going. He wanted her to say something that could be twisted into evidence of parental alienation or manipulation. "Emma, has your father ever said anything negative about your mother during these visits?" Emma hesitated. The honest answer was yes. Her father had occasionally expressed frustration about her mother, usually in the context of explaining why certain custody decisions had been made. But she knew that yes could be weaponized in this courtroom. "Not really," she said finally, which wasn't technically a lie. It was an evasion, but it wasn't a lie. "Not really. That's an interesting answer. Does that mean he has said negative things or he hasn't?" "He's explained things to me," Emma said, trying to be careful with her words. "But he hasn't tried to make me hate my mom or anything." Mr.'s lips curved into something that might have been a smile, but it looked more like a shark's grin. "Emma, I want to ask you something very important, and I want you to think carefully about your answer. Has your father ever told you that your mother was trying to keep you away from him? Has he ever suggested that your mother was being unfair or dishonest?" Emma's heart started pounding. This was the trap. If she said yes, it could be used as evidence that her father was poisoning her against her mother. If she said no, she'd be lying, and she didn't want to lie in court. She'd promised herself that she would tell the truth today, whatever that cost. He's talked to me about the custody situation, Emma said slowly. He's explained things, but he hasn't tried to turn me against my mom. But he has tried to explain things in a way that makes the custody situation seem like something your mother is doing to him. Isn't that correct? Mrs. Emma's father's lawyer stood up abruptly. Objection. The lawyer is putting words in the child's mouth and making assumptions. Judge Cross raised a hand. Sustained. Mister, please rephrase your question without the leading language. But the damage was done. Emma could see the judge's expression had shifted slightly. The seed of doubt had been planted. Maybe this girl was being manipulated. Maybe her answers couldn't be trusted. Maybe her apparent love for her father was actually parental alienation in disguise. The questioning continued for another 30 minutes. Mr. asked about Emma's mother's care of her, about whether Emma felt safe and loved at her mother's house. Emma answered honestly. Yes, she felt safe and loved. Her mother provided everything she needed physically. But there was a coldness there sometimes, a tension, a sense that her mother's love was conditional on Emma taking her side against her father. Then Mrs. got her turn. She was gentler in her questioning, asking Emma to describe specific moments with her father, times he'd helped her with homework, attended her school events, been there for her when she was hurt or scared. Emma's answers came more easily, more naturally. She described her father reading to her, helping her practice soccer, the way he always asked about her day and actually listened to her answers. By the end of the questioning, Emma felt emotionally exhausted. She'd been analyzed, questioned, and dissected like a laboratory specimen. She tried to tell the truth, but she could see from the judge's expression that the truth wasn't simple enough, wasn't clear enough, wasn't what either side wanted to hear. As she stepped down from the witness stand, her legs shaky and her heart heavy, Emma knew that words weren't going to save her. The lawyer's questions and her honest answers weren't going to change anything. The judge was still skeptical, still searching for the real truth beneath what she perceived as manipulation. That's when Emma realized that her plan wasn't just important anymore. It was absolutely essential. 6 months had passed since that extraordinary day in Judge Cross's courtroom. Emma sat in her father's kitchen on a Saturday morning, flour dusting her nose and hair, her hands covered in chocolate chip cookie dough. Max lay contentedly on his bed nearby, occasionally lifting his head to sniff the delicious aromas wafting through the kitchen. Everything felt different now, better, more real. The changes hadn't happened overnight. The first few weeks after Judge Cross's ruling had been awkward and filled with adjustment. Emma had moved back and forth between her mother's house and her father's house on alternating weeks, each transition bringing a mix of relief and sadness as she left one parent to be with the other. But something fundamental had shifted in both her parents' attitudes. They were trying, really trying. Her father had started the mandatory family therapy sessions immediately. At first, Emma had dreaded them. The idea of sitting in a therapist's office talking about her parents' divorce and the custody battle had seemed unbearable. But Doctor, the court-appointed family therapist, had turned out to be different from what Emma expected. She wasn't there to judge anyone or to take sides. She was there to help the family communicate better. In those therapy sessions, Emma had been able to say things she'd been holding inside for months. She'd told her father how scared she'd been, how much she hated the custody battle, how guilty she'd felt about loving both her parents equally when everyone seemed to expect her to choose. She'd been allowed to cry, to be angry, to express the full complexity of her emotions without fear of accidentally saying something that would be used as ammunition against one parent or the other. Her parents had also learned to communicate in the therapy sessions. They'd apologize to each other, not for the divorce itself, which had been necessary and unavoidable, but for the way they'd handled the aftermath. Emma's father had acknowledged that while he hadn't deliberately tried to alienate Emma from her mother, his frequent comments about custody arrangements and his frustration with the situation had created an environment where Emma felt conflicted. Her mother had acknowledged that her anger and hurt had sometimes manifested in ways that made Emma feel like she had to choose sides. But the most significant change had come about 2 months after the ruling, when something unexpected happened at one of their therapy sessions. "I'd like to propose something," her mother had said hesitantly, looking at Emma's father for the first time with something that resembled genuine warmth. "Emma, your father and I have been talking and we'd like to try having family dinners together, all 3 of us, once a month maybe, just to show you that we can be civil, that we can be around each other without it being difficult." Emma's heart had leaped at the suggestion. Her father had nodded in agreement. "I think that's a good idea," he'd said, and he'd reached across and squeezed her mother's hand, a gesture of solidarity and understanding, not romance, but something that showed deep respect and acceptance. The first family dinner had been awkward. They'd sat around Emma's mother's dining room table, and there had been long silences and careful conversations about neutral topics. But with each subsequent dinner, the awkwardness had diminished. Her parents had started remembering what they'd once liked about each other, not as romantic partners, but as 2 human beings who had created this incredible child together, and who both deserved to be in her life. Now, 6 months later, Emma could see her parents actually laugh together sometimes. They could coordinate Emma's schedule without tension or passive aggression. They could attend her school events without creating uncomfortable situations. They were co-parenting like adults instead of adversaries. And through it all, Max had been Emma's constant companion. The golden retriever seemed to sense that things had improved, that the household tension had dissipated. He was lighter somehow, his tail wagging more frequently, his energy more relaxed. He still gave Emma his undivided attention whenever she called on him, still responded to all the hand signals she'd trained him to recognize. But there was no longer the desperate quality to their connection that had characterized it during the custody battle. "Dad, these are ready for the oven," Emma said, gesturing to the baking sheets filled with cookie dough balls. Her father came over and kissed the top of her head, something he did frequently now, unafraid that the gesture would be used against him, unafraid that Emma would see it as a betrayal of her mother. Emma had permission to love both her parents openly now, and it made all the difference. As they slid the cookies into the oven, Emma's phone buzzed. A text from her mother, "Looking forward to our family dinner tonight. Your dad picking you up at 6, right? Max can come too." Emma's mother had warmed to Max significantly. She'd begun to understand that the dog represented something pure and good in Emma's life, unconditional love and loyalty that transcended adult complications. Now she welcomed Max into her home, and Emma could see that the dog's presence actually helped create a more relaxed atmosphere during their transitions. "Your mom's excited about dinner tonight," Emma told her father, showing him the text. Her father smiled, a genuine, happy smile. "I'm looking forward to it too. Your mom's making that pasta dish we all love, and I offered to bring wine. We're going to have a nice evening as a family." It was the most natural thing in the world, and yet 6 months ago it would have seemed impossible. The therapy sessions were ongoing, scheduled now on a monthly basis rather than weekly. Judge Cross had also maintained oversight through the court-appointed mediator, who checked in with Emma regularly to make sure everything was progressing well. But the mandatory check-ins were starting to feel less like legal requirements and more like genuine support. Emma had been back to Judge Cross's courtroom once, about 3 months after the initial ruling. The judge had wanted to see how the family was progressing. When Emma had walked in, accompanied by both her parents, Judge Cross's face had lit up with unmistakable warmth and approval. "I'm so glad to see you," Judge Cross had said, inviting them to sit. "How is everything going?" Emma's father and mother had both spoken about the positive changes. They'd talked about the therapy, about the monthly family dinners, about how they'd learned to communicate with respect even though their marriage had ended. Judge Cross had listened intently, asking questions, genuinely invested in their. At the end of the visit, Judge Cross had knelt down to Emma's level, just like she had in the courtroom months earlier. "Emma, I want you to know how proud I am of you and your family. You showed tremendous courage, and your parents have shown tremendous wisdom in accepting the opportunity to heal. Not all families manage this. Not all families turn their pain into growth, but yours did. That's remarkable." Then Judge Cross had asked Emma if Max had enjoyed the treats. Emma had told her yes, and the judge's face had lit up with genuine delight. "That dog," Judge Cross had said, "that dog changed everything. I've been thinking about your case a lot over these months, Emma. It's made me a better judge. It's made me remember that behind every legal case is a human story. A story about people trying to do the best they can with incomplete information and wounded hearts. Your case taught me to look for the truth beneath the arguments." Now, as Emma pulled the warm cookies from the oven and the chocolate began to melt into soft pools of deliciousness, she reflected on how much had changed. The custody battle that had felt so impossibly painful 6 months ago now seemed almost surreal, like it had happened to someone else. Max walked over to her and placed his head on her knee, his eyes looking up at her with that same devotion that had stopped Judge Cross in her tracks in the courtroom. Emma reached down and scratched behind his ears, the same way she'd done countless times before. "You know what, Max?" Emma whispered to her dog. "We did it. We actually did it. We showed them what mattered. We showed them the truth." Max's tail thumped against the floor, and Emma could almost swear he smiled. That evening, as Emma's father drove her to her mother's house for their family dinner, with Max in the back seat, his head out the window, his ears flapping in the wind, Emma felt a peace settle over her like a warm blanket. Her parents weren't going to get back together. That chapter of her family's story had closed. But they'd written a new chapter, one based on respect, on communication, on the shared goal of supporting their daughter. And it had all started with a girl, a dog, and the courage to show the truth when words failed. As they pulled up to her mother's house and Emma saw her mother standing on the porch, smiling warmly at them, Emma realized something profound. Her family wasn't broken anymore. It had transformed into something different, something more honest, something stronger because it had been tested and had emerged intact. The greatest gift Emma had given her parents wasn't the courtroom performance with Max. It was the reminder that love, real, unconditional, authentic love, was more important than winning, more important than being right, more important than any custody arrangement or legal victory. And as the three of them, Emma, her father, and Max, walked up to the porch to greet her mother, Emma knew that somehow, against all odds, her family had found their way home. The afternoon session of the hearing began at 2:15 p.m., just as the courthouse clock chimed. Emma sat in the gallery again, her heart beating so hard she thought everyone around her must be able to hear it. She still didn't know if Mrs. had been able to arrange for Max to be brought to the courthouse. The lawyer hadn't returned to speak with her before the afternoon session began. She'd just given Emma a look that conveyed both understanding and deep uncertainty. Emma's hands were trembling as she clasped them together in her lap. She'd changed back into her navy dress after lunch, though she'd never left the courthouse. She'd eaten a sandwich in the recess room but had barely tasted it. Her stomach felt like it was tying itself into increasingly complex knots. The afternoon session had opened with closing arguments from both sides. Mr. had stood before the judge and delivered a polished, professional summary of his client's position. He talked about the importance of maternal bonding, about how young girls especially needed their mothers during formative years. He'd referenced the concerning evidence of parental alienation. He'd painted a picture of Emma as a vulnerable, easily influenced child who needed protection from her father's manipulation. It had taken all of Emma's willpower not to stand up and shout at him again. Then Mrs. had stood for her rebuttal. She talked about Emma's obvious love for her father, about the quality time they spent together, about his consistent presence in her life. She'd made an impassioned argument about how joint custody honored both parents' roles and prevented a child from being weaponized by one parent against another. It had been a good argument, professional, well-reasoned, compelling. But Emma had seen the judge's expression, and she'd known that words, no matter how well chosen or carefully constructed, weren't going to change what Judge Cross had already decided in her mind. The judge believed that Emma had been influenced, manipulated, turned against her mother by her father. That belief had settled into her consciousness like sediment at the bottom of a river, and no amount of argument was going to dislodge it. That's when something unexpected happened. The courtroom doors opened, and Officer Martinez entered, followed by Emma's breath caught in her throat, her mother's boyfriend, walking Max into the courtroom on a leash. Everyone turned to look. Murmurs ran through the gallery. Mr. actually stood up, looking confused and slightly outraged that a dog had been brought into the proceedings without explanation. "Your Honor," Mrs. said quickly, her voice confident and calm, "I apologize for the unorthodox request, but I would like to present a final piece of evidence before you make your ruling." Judge Cross's expression shifted from stern to absolutely incredulous. "Ms., I'm not sure what you think you're doing, but I will not have a dog influence these proceedings. This is a courtroom, not a—" "Your Honor," Mrs. interrupted respectfully, "I understand this is highly unusual, but I believe the dog's presence is relevant to Emma's credibility. Emma has made a specific request, and I believe allowing her to have a moment with the dog in front of the court would serve the interests of justice." The judge looked like she wanted to reject this request immediately, but Mrs. continued before she could speak. "Your Honor, what we've heard today are conflicting narratives about Emma. Her mother's legal team argues that Emma has been manipulated and alienated from her mother by her father. The father's legal team argues that Emma loves both parents equally and has not been alienated. The question is, which narrative is true? Emma is too young to be a perfectly reliable witness in a legal sense, as we've seen. But there is another witness here, one that neither side has coached, neither side can manipulate, and neither side can influence. Judge Cross set down her pen. "Ms., I appreciate the creativity, but—" "The dog's name is Max," Mrs. said, and something in her tone made the judge pause. "He has been Emma's constant companion since she was 3 years old. He has lived through this custody battle with Emma, and I believe that the bond between them, displayed honestly before this court, will tell you more about Emma's emotional state and credibility than any amount of testimony can." There was silence in the courtroom. The judge looked skeptical, but she also looked intrigued, as if she recognized that this moment was going somewhere she hadn't expected to go. "I'm going to allow this," Judge Cross said finally, though her tone suggested she thought she might regret the decision. "But Ms., this better be leading somewhere. I don't have time for courtroom theatrics." "It will, Your Honor," Mrs. said confidently. Emma's heart was pounding so hard she felt dizzy. Led Max to the front of the courtroom, near the witness stand. The golden retriever's tail was wagging slightly, and his eyes were searching the courtroom until they found Emma. His entire body seemed to light up when he saw her. Officer Martinez brought Emma forward to stand near Max, but not too close. Everything was happening so fast, but also in slow motion. Emma could feel every eye in the courtroom on her. She could feel the judge watching intently. She could feel her mother's confusion, her father's hope, the lawyer's uncertainty. Mrs. turned to Emma. "Emma, I'm going to ask you to do something. I'm going to ask you to give Max a specific signal, the signal you've been training him to recognize, the signal that means something very specific to you. Can you do that?" Emma nodded, not trusting her voice. The judge leaned forward. "I don't understand what this is supposed to demonstrate." "Your Honor," Mrs. said, "you'll see in just a moment. Emma, whenever you're ready." Emma took a deep breath. She'd practiced this moment hundreds of times with Max, but never like this, never in a courtroom full of people, never with her entire future depending on the outcome. She looked at Max. Their eyes met, and in that moment all the nervousness fell away. It was just her and Max, just like in all their training sessions. Just two beings who understood each other without words. Emma raised her right hand slowly, her palm facing outward toward Max. She moved her hand in a gentle arc from left to right across her body, the movement graceful and subtle. It was the signal they'd practiced together, the truth signal, the one that meant Emma needed Max to be present with her, to show the world that they were connected in a way that transcended everything else. The courtroom was completely silent. Max stood up from his sitting position and walked directly to Emma. He pressed his head gently against her legs and refused to move. But more than that, the dog turned his head and looked directly at Judge Cross. He held her gaze with an intensity that seemed almost human, almost deliberate. The golden retriever's eyes were locked on the judge's eyes, and there was something in that gaze that transcended the simple dog-human relationship. It was devotion. It was trust. It was unconditional love from a being who had no capacity for manipulation, no agenda, no desire except to be near the person he loved most in the world. Emma stood completely still, her hand still raised in the signal position, her connection with Max visible and undeniable to everyone in the courtroom. The judge stopped breathing. Emma could see it, the exact moment when Judge Helena Cross's carefully constructed skepticism, her years of cynical experience, her logical mind that had developed immunity to emotional manipulation, the exact moment when all of that froze. Because what she was witnessing wasn't a dog performing a trick. What she was witnessing was love made visible. What she was witnessing was truth expressed in a language that transcended words and legal arguments and competing narratives. Emma's mother gasped audibly. Her father's eyes filled with tears. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. And in that crystalline moment, frozen in time, everything changed. Time seemed to stop in the courtroom. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the air itself seemed to have frozen in place. Judge Helena Cross remained absolutely motionless, her eyes locked on Max's eyes, and for the first time in her entire 28-year career on the bench, the judge appeared to be genuinely shaken. Emma stood perfectly still, her hand still raised in the signal position, barely breathing. Max remained pressed against her legs, his head held high, his gaze unwavering from the judge. It was as if the dog and the judge were having a conversation that nobody else in the courtroom could hear, a dialogue conducted entirely through sight and some deeper, unnamed sense. The court reporter's fingers had stopped moving across the stenotype machine. Officer Martinez stood frozen in his position by the door. Even Mr. seemed incapable of objecting or interrupting. The entire room had become a tableau, a frozen moment of profound significance. Then, very slowly, Judge Cross blinked. She removed her glasses deliberately and set them on the bench in front of her. She rubbed her eyes, and when she looked back up, something fundamental had shifted in her expression. The stern, cynical, hardened exterior that had been locked in place for decades seemed to have cracked, allowing something more human to shine through. The judge stood up from her elevated seat. This was highly irregular. Judges didn't stand up during proceedings unless there was a very specific reason. She descended the steps from her bench slowly and deliberately, her robes rustling with each step, and approached Emma and Max. Everyone in the courtroom watched in stunned silence as the powerful authority figure came to stand directly in front of the girl and her dog. Judge Cross knelt down, actually knelt down, something Emma was sure judges probably never did in their courtrooms, and looked at Emma face to face. For a long moment, the judge simply studied the girl's features. She looked at Emma's tear-stained cheeks, at her slightly trembling hands, at her eyes that held a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "You love your father very much, don't you?" Judge Cross said quietly, not as a judge asking a legal question, but as a woman speaking to a child. "Yes," Emma whispered. "And you love your mother, too." "Yes," Emma said again. Judge Cross turned her attention to Max. She reached out slowly and placed her hand on the dog's head. Max's tail wagged gently, acknowledging the gesture, but he didn't move away from Emma. His loyalty remained fixed on the girl. "This dog," Judge Cross said, still speaking in that quiet, almost awed tone, "this dog doesn't care about custody arrangements. He doesn't care about legal arguments or narratives or competing claims. He knows one thing and only one thing. He loves this girl and she needs him." The judge stood back up and turned to face the entire courtroom. Her expression had transformed. Where there had been stern skepticism, there was now something that looked remarkably like compassion. Where there had been cold professional distance, there was now human understanding. "I've been doing this job for a very long time," Judge Cross said, addressing the full courtroom, but her words seemed directed at both lawyers and both parents. "I've heard thousands of custody cases. I've listened to countless arguments about parental rights and the best interests of the child. I've made decisions that have torn families apart and decisions that have tried to hold families together. But I've never seen anything quite like what I just witnessed." She paused, looking directly at Emma again. "What I witnessed was not a performance. What I witnessed was not manipulation. What I witnessed was truth. Pure, simple, undeniable truth expressed in a language that transcends words and legal arguments." Mr. started to stand up, his face reddening. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I must object to this emotional reaction influencing your ruling. A dog's behavior is not admissible evidence." "Sit down, Mr." Judge Cross said sharply, and the lawyer immediately obeyed, as if he'd been physically pushed back into his chair. The judge's tone had shifted from reflective back to authoritative. "I know my courtroom procedures. I know what is and isn't admissible evidence. But what I also know, after nearly 3 decades on this bench, is that sometimes the most important truths can't be expressed through conventional legal channels. Sometimes they require a different kind of evidence entirely." She turned to face Emma's mother. "Mrs., I want you to understand something. Your daughter loves you. That's not a lie. That's not manipulation. That's a fundamental truth. But your daughter also loves her father, and she loves him equally. I can see it now, standing here, looking at this child and this dog. And I should have seen it earlier, but I was too busy looking for villainy and manipulation to see the simple truth of a child who loves both her parents. Emma's mother's face crumpled slightly, and she nodded, tears streaming down her face. Then Judge Cross turned to Emma's father. "And you, sir, I see now that you haven't been trying to turn your daughter against her mother. I see that you've simply been trying to maintain your relationship with your child. I see that your love is genuine and unconditional. That doesn't erase the pain of the divorce or the difficulty of the custody arrangement, but it tells me something important about your character." Emma's father was openly weeping now, his shoulders shaking as Mrs. placed a supportive hand on his back. Judge Cross walked back to Max and knelt down again. She looked into the dog's eyes with the same intensity that Max had shown her just moments earlier. "Thank you," she said simply to the dog. "Thank you for reminding me what really matters." Then she stood and returned to her bench. She sat down slowly and reached for her glasses, putting them back on, but her expression remained transformed. The hardness was gone, replaced by something warmer and more understanding. "I'm going to take a 30-minute recess," she announced. "I need some time to collect my thoughts and to write some orders that I believe will be in the best interests of this child and her family. When we reconvene, I will deliver my ruling." She banged her gavel once, sharply, and then descended from the bench and disappeared into her chambers. The courtroom erupted into controlled chaos. People stood up, whispering to each other. Mr. was conferring urgently with Emma's mother, looking shaken and concerned. Mrs. was embracing Emma's father, her face filled with cautious hope. Officer Martinez was leading Max back toward the doors, with following close behind. Emma felt Mrs. hand on her shoulder. "Emma, come with me. Your father wants to see you." For the first time in months, Emma was allowed to move through the courtroom barrier that had separated her from her parents. She walked toward her father, and he swept her up into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. "I'm so proud of you," her father whispered into her hair. "I'm so incredibly proud of you." Emma's mother also approached, somewhat hesitantly. She stood for a moment, then reached out and gently touched Emma's shoulder. "That was very brave," she said quietly. "What you did in there, that was the bravest thing I've ever seen." For the first time in the entire ordeal, Emma felt like she'd actually been heard. Not interpreted, not manipulated, not analyzed through a lens of parental conflict. Just heard. She had given Max the signal, and Max had responded with perfect clarity. And together, they had broken through the walls of legal procedure and professional skepticism and cynical experience. Together, they had shown Judge Helena Cross something that had been hidden beneath layers of legal argument. The simple, profound truth of a child who needed both her parents, who loved both her parents, and who deserved to have both her parents in her life. The judge's realization had been the breaking of a dam, and now, in that 30-minute recess, everything was going to change. The 30-minute recess stretched into 45 minutes. Emma sat with her father in a small consultation room, her hand never leaving his arm. She was terrified that this moment would end, that she'd be separated from him again, that the magic of what had happened with Max in the courtroom would somehow dissolve and everything would go back to the way it had been. Her father, sensing her fear, kept reassuring her. "Whatever happens now, I want you to know that I'm proud of you. What you did today was extraordinary. You showed more courage than most adults could manage. You stood up for yourself, for your family, for the truth. That's all I've ever wanted for you, Emma, to be able to tell the truth and have people listen." Mrs. entered the room about 10 minutes before they were due to reconvene. She looked different somehow, lighter, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "The judge wants to see both of you in her chambers before the hearing resumes," Mrs. said. "Just you, Emma, and your father. This is highly unusual, but the judge is requesting it." Emma's father exchanged a look with his lawyer, then stood up and extended his hand to his daughter. Together, they followed Mrs. through the courthouse corridors to the judge's private chambers. Judge Cross was sitting at her desk, which was covered with documents and notepads filled with her handwriting. She looked up as they entered, and her expression was warm, almost gentle. "Please sit down," she said, gesturing to 2 chairs in front of her desk. Emma and her father sat, their hands still clasped together. "I want to tell you both something before I deliver my ruling in open court," Judge Cross began. "Emma, what you did today took enormous courage. You didn't just give me evidence of your love for your father. You gave me a mirror. You showed me something I needed to see about myself." The judge stood and walked over to the window, looking out at the city beyond the courthouse. 28 years ago, when I first came to this bench, I believed that my job was to cut through emotion and find the truth. I believed that objectivity meant distance, that fairness meant skepticism. Over the years, that approach served me well. It helped me make rational decisions in situations that could have been swayed by manipulation or sentiment. She paused, still looking out the window. "But somewhere along the way, I forgot something important. I forgot that truth isn't always rational. Love isn't always logical. And sometimes the most important evidence a judge can hear is the evidence of a human heart." Judge Cross turned back to face them. "What I witnessed in that courtroom today, your love for your daughter, her love for both you and her mother, the bond between her and that dog, that was evidence of something real, something true, something that no amount of legal argument could deny or distort." She returned to her desk and picked up a thick document she'd been working on. I've spent the last 45 minutes writing an order that I believe serves your family's best interests, and I want to explain it to you before I read it in open court, so that you understand my reasoning." Judge Cross sat back down. "First, I'm ruling that Emma will have equal joint custody with both parents. She will spend equal time in each household, alternating weeks, or whatever arrangement the two of you can agree on that works best for Emma's schedule and needs. Neither parent has priority. Neither parent is the primary custodian. You are equal partners in raising this child." Emma's father's face showed relief and gratitude. Emma felt tears building in her eyes. "Second," Judge Cross continued, "I'm making mandatory family therapy a condition of this custody arrangement. Both of you will attend therapy sessions with a court-appointed therapist. You will learn how to communicate with each other as co-parents, separate from your personal relationship. You will learn how to put Emma's needs first before your own anger or hurt. This isn't optional. This isn't a suggestion. This is a requirement, and failure to comply will result in modification of the custody arrangement." She looked directly at Emma's father. "This includes you being willing to acknowledge any mistakes you may have made during the custody battle. And you need to understand something important. Even unintentional alienation is still alienation. Even if you didn't deliberately try to turn Emma against her mother, if your comments or behavior created an environment where Emma felt conflicted about her relationship with her mother, that needs to be addressed in therapy." Then she turned her gaze to Emma. "And you need to understand something too, Emma. What you did today was brave and intelligent, but you should never have had to do it. Adults have the responsibility to protect children from adult conflicts. Your parents' divorce, their custody battle, that shouldn't have been your burden to carry. Therapy will help your family learn how to shield you from that kind of emotional labor in the future." "Third," Judge Cross said, returning to her document, "I'm appointing a family mediator to oversee Emma's transitions between households. This person will be a neutral third party who will help facilitate communication between you and your ex-wife, who will monitor Emma's emotional, and who will report back to me on the effectiveness of the arrangement every 6 months for the next 2 years. If at any point I find that either parent is not complying with the spirit of this order, I will not hesitate to modify the arrangement." Emma's father nodded, accepting these terms without resistance. "Finally," Judge Cross said, and her voice took on a warmer tone, "I want to acknowledge something that I think is important for Emma to hear right now in this moment. Emma, you are not responsible for your family's problems. You are not responsible for fixing your parents' relationship or for keeping them happy. Your only job is to be a 9-year-old girl. Your only job is to grow up, to learn, to play, to be happy. Do you understand that?" Emma nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face. "The adults in your life let you down," Judge Cross continued gently. We fought over you, argued about you, used you as evidence in our disputes. We should have been protecting you from all of that. We weren't. And I'm sorry for that, Emma. I'm sorry that you had to come to my courtroom and show me that you and your dog loved each other in order for me to understand what should have been obvious from the beginning. That you're a real person with real feelings and real needs, not a case to be solved. The judge opened a drawer in her desk and pulled out a small treat bag. I had the bailiff pick these up during recess. They're for Max. I owe that dog a debt of gratitude. He taught me more about justice in 5 minutes than I've learned in 28 years on the bench. Emma took the treat bag, clutching it carefully. Thank you, Your Honor. Max will love these. Now, Judge Cross said, we're going to go back into that courtroom and I'm going to read this order formally on the record. But I want you both to understand, this ruling isn't just about custody and visitation schedules. This ruling is about recognizing that love, genuine love, is more important than winning. Both of you love Emma. Both of you should be in her life. And your job now is to learn how to co-parent with compassion, with respect, and with Emma's as your guiding principle. She stood, signaling that the meeting was over. I think your family has a real chance at healing. Not going back to how things were before the divorce, that's not possible, but creating something new, something healthier, something that allows Emma to love both of you without guilt, without conflict, without having to choose. As they walked back toward the courtroom, Emma felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time since the divorce had begun, she felt like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. Not perfect, not without pain or adjustment, but okay. Real, honest, based on truth rather than legal maneuvering. And it had all started with a girl giving her dog a signal, and a judge finally understanding what truly mattered. 6 months had passed since that extraordinary day in Judge Cross's courtroom. Emma sat in her father's kitchen on a Saturday morning, flour dusting her nose and hair, her hands covered in chocolate chip cookie dough. Max lay contentedly on his bed nearby, occasionally lifting his head to sniff the delicious aromas wafting through the kitchen. Everything felt different now. Better. More real. The changes hadn't happened overnight. The first few weeks after Judge Cross's ruling had been awkward and filled with adjustment. Emma had moved back and forth between her mother's house and her father's house on alternating weeks, each transition bringing a mix of relief and sadness as she left one parent to be with the other. But something fundamental had shifted in both her parents' attitudes. They were trying, really trying. Her father had started the mandatory family therapy sessions immediately. At first, Emma had dreaded them. The idea of sitting in a therapist's office talking about her parents' divorce and the custody battle had seemed unbearable. But Doctor, the court-appointed family therapist, had turned out to be different from what Emma expected. She wasn't there to judge anyone or to take sides. She was there to help the family communicate better. In those therapy sessions, Emma had been able to say things she'd been holding inside for months. She'd told her father how scared she'd been, how much she hated the custody battle, how guilty she'd felt about loving both her parents equally when everyone seemed to expect her to choose. She'd been allowed to cry, to be angry, to express the full complexity of her emotions without fear of accidentally saying something that would be used as ammunition against one parent or the other. Her parents had also learned to communicate in the therapy sessions. They'd apologize to each other, not for the divorce itself, which had been necessary and unavoidable, but for the way they'd handled the aftermath. Emma's father had acknowledged that while he hadn't deliberately tried to alienate Emma from her mother, his frequent comments about custody arrangements and his frustration with the situation had created an environment where Emma felt conflicted. Her mother had acknowledged that her anger and hurt had sometimes manifested in ways that made Emma feel like she had to choose sides. But the most significant change had come about 2 months after the ruling, when something unexpected happened at one of their therapy sessions. "I'd like to propose something," her mother had said hesitantly, looking at Emma's father for the first time with something that resembled genuine warmth. "Emma, your father and I have been talking, and we'd like to try having family dinners together, all 3 of us, once a month maybe, just to show you that we can be civil, that we can be around each other without it being difficult." Emma's heart had leaped at the suggestion. Her father had nodded in agreement. "I think that's a good idea," he'd said, and he'd reached across and squeezed her mother's hand, a gesture of solidarity and understanding, not romance, but something that showed deep respect and acceptance. The first family dinner had been awkward. They'd sat around Emma's mother's dining room table, and there had been long silences and careful conversations about neutral topics. But with each subsequent dinner, the awkwardness had diminished. Her parents had started remembering what they'd once liked about each other, not as romantic partners, but as 2 human beings who had created this incredible child together, and who both deserved to be in her life. Now, 6 months later, Emma could see her parents actually laugh together sometimes. They could coordinate Emma's schedule without tension or passive aggression. They could attend her school events without creating uncomfortable situations. They were co-parenting like adults instead of adversaries. And through it all, Max had been Emma's constant companion. The golden retriever seemed to sense that things had improved, that the household tension had dissipated. He was lighter somehow, his tail wagging more frequently, his energy more relaxed. He still gave Emma his undivided attention whenever she called on him, still responded to all the hand signals she'd trained him to recognize. But there was no longer the desperate quality to their connection that had characterized it during the custody battle. "Dad, these are ready for the oven," Emma said, gesturing to the baking sheets filled with cookie dough balls. Her father came over and kissed the top of her head, something he did frequently now, unafraid that the gesture would be used against him, unafraid that Emma would see it as a betrayal of her mother. Emma had permission to love both her parents openly now, and it made all the difference. As they slid the cookies into the oven, Emma's phone buzzed. A text from her mother. "Looking forward to our family dinner tonight. Your dad picking you up at 6, right? Max can come too." Emma's mother had warmed to Max significantly. She'd begun to understand that the dog represented something pure and good in Emma's life, unconditional love and loyalty that transcended adult complications. Now she welcomed Max into her home, and Emma could see that the dog's presence actually helped create a more relaxed atmosphere during their transitions. "Your mom's excited about dinner tonight," Emma told her father, showing him the text. Her father smiled, a genuine, happy smile. "I'm looking forward to it too. Your mom's making that pasta dish we all love, and I offered to bring wine. We're going to have a nice evening as a family." It was the most natural thing in the world, and yet 6 months ago it would have seemed impossible. The therapy sessions were ongoing, scheduled now on a monthly basis rather than weekly. Judge Cross had also maintained oversight through the court-appointed mediator, who checked in with Emma regularly to make sure everything was progressing well. But the mandatory check-ins were starting to feel less like legal requirements and more like genuine support. Emma had been back to Judge Cross's courtroom once, about 3 months after the initial ruling. The judge had wanted to see how the family was progressing. When Emma had walked in, accompanied by both her parents, Judge Cross's face had lit up with unmistakable warmth and approval. "I'm so glad to see you," Judge Cross had said, inviting them to sit. "How is everything going?" Emma's father and mother had both spoken about the positive changes. They'd talked about the therapy, about the monthly family dinners, about how they'd learned to communicate with respect even though their marriage had ended. Judge Cross had listened intently, asking questions, genuinely invested in their. At the end of the visit, Judge Cross had knelt down to Emma's level, just like she had in the courtroom months earlier. "Emma, I want you to know how proud I am of you and your family. You showed tremendous courage, and your parents have shown tremendous wisdom in accepting the opportunity to heal. Not all families manage this. Not all families turn their pain into growth, but yours did. That's remarkable." Then Judge Cross had asked Emma if Max had enjoyed the treats. Emma had told her yes, and the judge's face had lit up with genuine delight. "That dog," Judge Cross had said, "that dog changed everything. I've been thinking about your case a lot over these months, Emma. It's made me a better judge. It's made me remember that behind every legal case is a human story. A story about people trying to do the best they can with incomplete information and wounded hearts. Your case taught me to look for the truth beneath the arguments." Now, as Emma pulled the warm cookies from the oven and the chocolate began to melt into soft pools of deliciousness, she reflected on how much had changed. The custody battle that had felt so impossibly painful 6 months ago now seemed almost surreal, like it had happened to someone else. Max walked over to her and placed his head on her knee, his eyes looking up at her with that same devotion that had stopped Judge Cross in her tracks in the courtroom. Emma reached down and scratched behind his ears, the same way she'd done countless times before. "You know what, Max?" Emma whispered to her dog. "We did it. We actually did it. We showed them what mattered. We showed them the truth." Max's tail thumped against the floor, and Emma could almost swear he smiled. That evening, as Emma's father drove her to her mother's house for their family dinner, with Max in the back seat, his head out the window, his ears flapping in the wind, Emma felt a peace settle over her like a warm blanket. Her parents weren't going to get back together. That chapter of her family's story had closed. But they'd written a new chapter, one based on respect, on communication, on the shared goal of supporting their daughter. And it had all started with a girl, a dog, and the courage to show the truth when words failed. As they pulled up to her mother's house and Emma saw her mother standing on the porch, smiling warmly at them, Emma realized something profound. Her family wasn't broken anymore. It had transformed into something different, something more honest, something stronger because it had been tested and had emerged intact. The greatest gift Emma had given her parents wasn't the courtroom performance with Max. It was the reminder that love, real, unconditional, authentic love, was more important than winning, more important than being right, more important than any custody arrangement or legal victory. And as the three of them, Emma, her father, and Max, walked up to the porch to greet her mother, Emma knew that somehow, against all odds, her family had found their way home.